I want to have cognitive frameworks that are based on something replicable, scientifically oriented and validated as much as is possible. And so I'm very interested in the idea of the scientific underpinnings, because if we know those based on data and we know how they interact, then we can do leadership, if you want to say it that way, I think, much more effectively. And so that's the driver of, if we're going to do this thing, if we're going to try to be leaders, then let's understand how that works in a real way. Welcome to The Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader.
I'm your co-host, Justin Hamrick, and today we have a really exciting episode because we're going to be diving deep into a topic that's been debated for decades, if not centuries, and forms the basis of this entire platform, and it's the science of leadership. So the question is, what makes a great leader? Is it something innate, like charisma, or is it a skill that can be honed and refined? Today, we're going to uncover how leadership became the subject of scientific study and how we have the perfect person to guide us through it. Our host and creator of this platform, Dr. Tom Collins. So, TC, I guess my first question is, how did the science of leadership come to be? How did it go from being really a psychological or philosophical term to people sort of really looking at it as a scientific endeavor and something that could be measured?
Yeah, there's so much to that question. If we look at the history of leadership and what's been written about it, we can go back millennia. The Chinese wrote a lot about it. Sun Tzu, the great general, some say maybe mythical in a sense, and other contemporaries wrote extensively about it, and other ancient cultures as well talked about it with regards mostly to military operations, but those applications were much bigger. To get to the question of leadership, it really was around the turn of the 20th century where we start to see the idea of exploring the concept of leadership and management became this concept, and those two were differentiated later, and subsequently others have studied, and I've studied and written about that. But it was around the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s, where people were really starting to think about the concept of leadership. And mostly that was still, again, in the context of military, but we were beginning to see large organizations that were industrial. So it was the industrialization that began in the 1880s that sort of developed to a point where people were looking to improve efficiency and capacity and organizational growth and development, that people started thinking methodically about the concept of leadership as well as this idea of management, and the two are conflated, and they remain so for so many people. And so Frederick Taylor was this industrial engineer who came up with scientific management, which was used principally by General Motors to improve efficiency, so that basically you had one person doing a specific job that was reproducible, and they studied that and made it efficient. He only saw people as cogs in a wheel, but that's the way it started. And then the military, the United States military, really spent a lot of effort, especially around World War II and immediately thereafter, studying what makes a great leader, a successful leader, and how that can play out, and what are the keys that are needed. And at that time, early on, in the early 1900s up to World War II, people thought about what's called the great man theory, that people were just born with certain traits that made them great leaders. And then over the decades, other concepts have come along. Ohio State and Michigan did work in the 50s where they were studying, were you task oriented, were you people oriented? And various ideas have since been produced, whether it's servant leadership or skills based or behavioral or situational leadership, authentic leadership. There are probably 15 relatively large theories on leadership. But that's, and I don't want to bore everybody with a huge amount of theory, but that's kind of how it's played out as far as the study of leadership. And people have been, again, trying to figure it out. And most of, when you read the leadership, quote unquote, leadership literature, most of it is in the context now of corporations and businesses. And fundamentally, how does somebody help an organization make money? At the end of the day, if you just distill it down, how are we going to be really efficient and make money?
Yeah.
We'll have better leaders. And for me, that's not what I'm going for when I think about leadership. I think that leadership is, and we've talked about this previously, defining leadership as influencing others to achieve a common goal. And that can be done in any situation. That doesn't have to be relegated to, I work for Microsoft or GM or pick some, Fortune 100 company or whatever. Leadership is, how do you influence your children, your spouse, significant other, parents, neighbors, anybody, so that you can work together to achieve a common goal.
So, it sounds like the idea of leadership as a science started to emerge when people started to ask, is leadership something that can be measured, tested, and like you said, learned? It wasn't some innate characteristic that people just were born with or you didn't. So, it sounds like the psychology of leadership started to really meld with the science of leadership. Is that something that's happened in the last 20 years? Or are you talking about that's when, sort of in the industrial revolution, I guess, when it really started, they're like, this is something we can measure. This is something that we can really study and have data for.
Yeah, I think that, so you've mentioned the word psychology a number of times, and psychology plays such an enormous role in leadership, effective leadership, even in what some would call bad or unethical leadership. I try to distinguish the two, but if you take those despots in history, they were psychological manipulators. They knew how to manipulate people. And so psychology is a major thing. And so as psychology as a field has developed and matured, then so has leadership study, because people begin to see, oh, here are these cognitive biases, heuristics, and so on. Wow, that applies to leadership in this way or that. So it's becoming more mature as other fields become more mature, and we borrow from that, and we investigate that and find those sorts of things happen. So that's really, I think, as I look back at the various works that have been written, I would mark around the 1950s as the beginning, the really strong beginnings of academic study of leadership and theory, and then that progressing reached, some would argue, maybe in the 80s or 90s, kind of peaked and sort of plateaued since then. I don't know if that's true. I think it's just become more mature and diversified to the point that where does it stop and start, perhaps?
So we've talked a lot about the history of leadership and the science behind it, and sort of going all the way back to ancient times through the industrial revolution, now up to sort of modern times. But I guess one thing for our listeners is, how did you get involved in leadership? And specifically, when you started studying leadership, the science behind it. What really got your interests, not only in leadership, but in really wanting to know the data and the science behind it?
Sure. I think to answer the second question first, that is, why was I interested in the science of leadership? Is probably because I'm scientifically oriented. That sounds ridiculous, but as a physician scientist who has done research in the domain where I specialize, that's how I think. I want to have cognitive frameworks that are based on something replicable, scientifically oriented and validated as much as is possible. And so I'm very interested in the idea of the scientific underpinnings, because if we know those based on data and we know how they interact, then we can do leadership, if you want to say it that way, I think, much more effectively. And so that's the driver of, if we're going to do this thing, if we're going to try to be leaders, then let's understand how that works in a real way. There's a lot, there is so much out there, so much information that's just Tom and Justin making up stuff when it comes to leadership. So much. I would say 95%. I'm just picking a number out of thin air. But in my reading of now north of 300 books on the subject of leadership, the large majority is one person's opinion that isn't grounded in science or anything of that nature. And I think that can lead people astray. And so I wanted to make sure that if I was going to pursue something, that I was doing it the best of my ability based on scientific reason and logic and something that has been shown.
So I guess that really brings me to my next question, is what you mentioned. Like, obviously, if you Google leadership podcast, your inbox will be full. I mean, there's just so much content out there. Can you elaborate a little bit on what value you think this platform and this podcast will bring, and why people should invest their time and effort into it in an overcrowded leadership space?
Yeah. Again, I think it gets back to what's dependable, what can you count on, what is the scientific underpinning, and trying to honestly help other people be the best possible leaders that they can be by delivering to them proven concepts, not things that Tom just fabricated, or it seems to me that this would work, or what have you, but things that people have studied, and then combining that, the sort of storyline of every episode that we do is what is referred to as what, so what, now what. And that is, what's the topic? So going through the leadership literature and the work that I've done and so forth, what's the topic? Well, today we're going to talk about leading from the front, let's say. Okay, what is that? This is what leading from the front is. So what? That is, why is it important? It's important because these things, and people have proven it's important because of these things. This study and that study and the other showed that if you lead from the front, this happens positively and that happens positively. And if you don't lead from the front, these negative things happen. So that people understand, oh, leading from the front is valuable. I should probably do that. Okay, now what? That is, how do we do it? And then we provide, it may be one or two or three things, or sometimes there's so many, I might rattle off 10. But ways that people can begin to incorporate that key concept into their own leadership. And I haven't found any podcast that does that, is oriented in the way that the science of leadership is. And that's the reason to create it, so that people can come to it. Hey, here's this one episode. They're talking about this thing. You will know what it is. You will know the science behind why it's important, and you will leave with practical ways to be better. It's up to you whether or not you actuate those in your life, but the information is there, and it's all wrapped in stories. Every episode we have folks on, we say, hey, what did that look like in your life? How did that play out when you did it? What about when you screwed it up? What was the result? So that people can get the human story, because as humans, we're not made for spreadsheets. We're not made for remembering a litany of numbers. We're made for story. And so trying to build story into it, that's the other thing. So that's memorable and packageable.
So obviously you sort of talked about the framework you've developed, but besides sort of looking at the science and the research out there and your own experiences, what data have you gathered or research have you collected that makes this different, that makes this sort of fresh? Where did you get that research and data from?
Yeah. Well, this will help me, or allow me to answer the question you asked earlier. I said, I'll answer the second part first. Here's the first part, is why an interest in leadership for me. And then I can tell you how that played out in story, hopefully, into the answer to the question you just asked. So I'd been identified throughout life as a leader by some, and to be a leader by others, and high potential and all this sort of thing. And so in 2018, as I was considering the future of my career, do I want to be a chief, I realized that there was something that may be missing, that I probably didn't know some things about doing that. Even though I had
in your own characteristics,
right,
that you saw missing.
In my armamentarium, if you will, that I probably was lacking. And so if I'm going to be a leader of other folks and helping drive their career success and so forth, that means being a leader, right? Leading some program or whatever. That means being a leader. Okay, well, I had other trainings and experiences to that point, but what would it look like to really dig into it, to become an expert? If somebody's going to put their career in my hands as far as helping them build it, I need to be really darn good at that. That's a huge responsibility. So I decided I would start reading leadership books. And that was in March of 2018. And I read 130 in about 18 months, and then decided, okay, I got the big concepts and the ideas down. I've got a framework for how this works, but I'm probably missing stuff. There are things that I don't know, the unknown unknowns, as they're called. And so I started looking for a master's program that I could do in leadership. I did that through the Citadel. I had a great time. I mean, it was so nice to be back in learning mode as opposed to being the professor who's teaching, right? Different things to medical students, trainees, and that. To be in the learning mode where I'm just the person who's actually getting to learn new stuff. And so during that experience of my master's, I had a number of ideas for research studies on leadership, and I began doing those as I was going along. And one of those studies was to differentiate between leadership and management. And so I did a big study on that. Yeah, I did a big study on that where I did this analysis of 71 experts in the field who are the people who write all the studies and papers and things on how they define leadership and how they define management, and determine that you can actually differentiate the two empirically. So they are different. And so that was one of the things, and that informs some of the work that we're doing here with this podcast. But the thing that most informs all of this was an idea that I had. I think it was maybe the fall of 2020. So I was starting my second semester in the master's, and I got this idea because by that point I'd read over, I think, 200 books on leadership, and I got this idea. It was like, what is the book that I cannot find on the market that I would love to read? What's that? What would that book be? And I was in the military, and so I have an orientation toward the military, and the book that came to mind was The Leadership Wisdom of 4-Star Generals. Like, that would be so cool if I could have a book that where the 4-star generals of the United States military just sort of spilled out their wisdom. This is how you become great leaders. And it had stories that applied those concepts and things of that nature. Like, I would love to read that book. That book did not exist. And so for quite a while, I was trying to figure out, okay, as a scientist and a writer, I've got that skill set to do to write the book. I came up with this idea. It's my responsibility. I'm supposed to do this book, right? Like, that's insane. How do you go about just bumping into 4-star generals? Right? Like, they don't, like, they're hard to get in touch with. Okay? And then convince that this is of no nefarious intent. I'm just actually trying to do what I'm saying I'm trying to do, write this book, And so for a long time, I was trying to figure that out. And that study that I did with leadership and management, one of the participants in it was a 3-star general. And so after the study was over, I had emailed him and said, hey, I would like to just talk to you about leadership stuff. Could we do that sometime? And so we did that on Zoom, and we were talking. And I said, I got this crazy idea for a study that I want to do and write a book about. I want to interview 4-star generals, scientifically ask them all the same questions and analyze their answers and see what their perspectives are on leadership. And he was like, that's a great idea. I said, well, can you get me in touch with a 4-star general? This guy is a 3-star, okay? One step below. He said, I don't know any. Oh, good. A 3-star general doesn't know how to get in touch with.
This will be easy.
Yeah, exactly. He said, but what you could do, I was at Stanford at the time, and he said, the Hoover Institute at Stanford has a couple of 4-stars there. You should just see if one of them would talk with you. And maybe you can interview that person, and then maybe they can connect you with some other people. Hey, that's reasonable. He said, also check on LinkedIn. Maybe somebody will respond to you on LinkedIn. I thought, that's the craziest idea. I mean, I'm not going to just tell him to his face, sir, that's insane. Nobody's going to talk to me on LinkedIn. But he was right. He was right on both counts. And so I emailed, as soon as we got off the thing, the Zoom call, I emailed the folks at the Hoover Institute, and I said, hey, I'm doing this study approved by the Institutional Review Board and all that, where I want to interview 4-star generals. I understand there's a couple at the Hoover Institute. Could you see if they would be willing to do that? And she said, sure. She got back to me the next day. She said, we have a couple right now. One of them is busy writing his own book. He said, no, thank you. The other, General Jim Mattis, said he would be happy to do it. And I was just like, Jim Mattis. Like that, he in my mind is, I've told my wife, of all people on earth, I think Jim Mattis is the person I would most like to have dinner with. Because when he was the Secretary of Defense, he performed in such a way, he demonstrated such character that it was just astounding. And so for him to be the first person in my study, It's just phenomenal. And he still calls me Dr. Tom. Like, we've interacted multiple times since then. And every time I can't believe this is happening. This is so surreal. But anyway, so I got to interview him. And then through LinkedIn, I was able to connect to a few. And then they participated and they helped me reach out. And my goal was 50 4-star generals and admirals, which at any given time, right now we have the most living 4-stars in American history. And for our listeners, 4-star generals and admirals are the highest ranking officers in their branch of the military, as high as it gets. And right now we have about 250 living 4-stars. And I interviewed 51 for my book. And so that was over about a 9-month period. I did these interviews, 1-hour interviews, and I asked them all the same questions, same 4 questions. Then I took all those transcripts and analyzed them scientifically to look at what exactly are they talking about here and what are the themes that they're talking about and how do those connect with each other, and spent a long time, untold hours of analyzing those data to arrive at the information that is part of this podcast, as well as the book that I've been working on and subsequent books to follow. But that created this framework of the 4 C's, or 4 stars of leadership: character, competence, caring, and communication. Those were the 4 pillars that really boiled out of that study of the 4 stars.
I mean, it sounds like, hearing you describe it, you basically created, through all that research and all that time, the Cochrane review, if you will, of military and really leadership in general. I mean, that taking that knowledge base, while you say if it's one person's opinion, maybe it doesn't matter, but then when you start combining all these people that have been in leadership positions and seeing what signal sort of pops out by analyzing the data, that starts to carry some weight. It's not just one person's opinion. You're like, over these, how many years combined of careers of
nearly
really
2,000.
leading people, 22,000 of
Nearly
leading people,
2,000. Yeah, nearly 2,000 years.
that it really sort of pops up, and you actually, this is not one person's opinion and observation. This is actually the data. This is the data of looking at this group of people that have been in leadership positions, and what worked for them worked for 97% of people. This didn't work for less than 20% of people. To be able to give that to our listeners, I think is just huge.
Yeah,
so,
and to fill out a little bit more information on these folks, okay? So I said nearly 2,000 years of military leadership experience. That doesn't include the leadership experience, because these are all retired 4-stars. That doesn't include the 10, 20, 30 years of experience on corporation boards, presidents of universities, founders and CEOs, all these things that these people have done since then. I'm just talking about 2,000 years of military leadership experience. So most of them were in the military for 36 plus years, which is incredible. And they're being trained that whole time, and they're leading that whole time, right? So if you take at their height, because I got these data from them, if you take the largest number of personnel that they commanded in their career, the average 140,000 people that these individuals led on average. And it ranged up to over 3 million. And then if you look at the annual budget, quote unquote, which is really hard to do when you're talking about the military, because it doesn't make sense, but for the sake of listeners and readers, I wanted to have a number, and the average was 12 billion with a B dollars per year. Now, if you take, let's say, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, okay, the highest ranking naval officer in the whole Pacific Fleet, They're in charge of things all over the place. They have $500 billion in materiel, that is bases and planes and boats and ships and all this stuff. That's not even included in this with regards to, I'm just talking about operations and maintenance, 12 billion a year. So dwarfing, for our listeners who are wondering, what do these people know? Dwarfing nearly any other organization that people will come across with regard to size and with regard to budget. Not to mention the fact that we're talking about the safety and security of the United States of America and our Constitution. That responsibility too, oh, by the way.
We've obviously covered a lot in the history of it, from ancient times to modern psychology to modern data. I guess sort of looking into the crystal ball and how this podcast fits into it, where do you think the science of leadership is headed? Like, what do you see in our lifetime in the next 20 years? What does the science of leadership look like? And how is this podcast helping our listeners get there?
Yeah. My hope is that people begin to realize that those things that make a great leader are the same things that make a great life. Look, whether you're in a leadership role or not, if you're a person of character, you know what you're doing, you're competent, you care about other people in a real way, and you're able to communicate with them very well, that's magic, whether you're a leader or not. Everybody wants to be around somebody like that, okay? And so my hope is that, to some degree, people start to realize that those things are part and parcel to a great life and to being, on some level, a better human that other people want to be around and work with, So that's one part of it. The other part, and this is my passion, I think. This is where it's at. That's the whole point for my book, or books. The whole point for this podcast, the whole point for everything that I'm trying to do is I know, I was going to say believe, I know everybody can be better leaders. Everybody. It's just having the tools to be able to do it. Tools that work, tools that are proven, that aren't flash in the pan. I did this thing, I got popular on TikTok or whatever, but legitimate tools that anybody can, if they just study them and practice them and activate them in their lives and seek to become better at those things, can be better leaders. And fundamentally, I believe, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna, but I believe that if we can build better leaders, we can build a better future for our kids and our grandkids and those who come after us. It's clear to me that we've done a terrible job with a lot of things in society, and that can be traced to people in leadership positions, differentiating that from leaders, people in leadership positions who are taking advantage of other people for their own gain. And I think that's fundamental to what we've got going on.
So with
now.
all that history and everything, we always talk about the what, so what, now what. So what can the listeners expect from this podcast in your work when they go to listen to other episodes? What are we expecting? I hear where you want it to go, where you see it going, but what can our listeners expect to get from this?
Well, I think it gets back to, again, that idea of what, so what, now what. They can expect us to put a lot of effort. I mean, a lot. People don't understand the amount of effort that goes into creating an episode of a podcast that identifies a single leadership concept that is highly important, that you can get your mind around and that you can start working on today. So finding those, and I've got so many from the work that I've done, over 160, I think it is, different concepts that we'll be fleshing out in the hopefully years to come. But finding a concept like that, talking about why it's important from the scientific standpoint, this is why you need to be thinking about this. And then helping people to understand this is how you do it. This is what you need to be working on to do this. And we're going to do that week in, week out with high quality folks. I really am putting forth a lot of effort to get as much as I can diverse people. I've got a bunch of 4-star generals and admirals who are going to be on, but people who are in different positions, CEOs and chief medical officers and university presidents and Division I coaches and or other coaches for that matter, and just people from all different areas that are leading and have expertise in that space, so that they can come and we can talk about, what does this concept look like in your domain? How has that been borne out in your world? I don't know that they will all be expert at that particular concept. I'm actually working very hard to do that, to find experts on those specific concepts and get them to be on as guests. But that's what I can say.
So I guess that it leaves me with the now what. So maybe this is the first one that they've listened to, the why, the how we got here. What do they do now? Do they need to start from episode 1? Like, what would you suggest they do now if they've heard this, they want to know the science behind leadership, and they want to be a better leader in whatever they do, whether it's being a parent or a spouse or a leader at work or anything? How do they go about doing that now?
Yeah, I think as it pertains to our cache of episodes, the thing about it that I've tried to work on is to have them be standalone, so that you don't necessarily have to go back, and it's not like a story necessarily that you have to start at the beginning and follow.
Yeah.
That you can kind of fall into it wherever it may be, and you can learn something that day with that particular podcast, and that will serve you well. The only caveat being that you and I have done multiple episodes, and we did cover initially sort of in order. We did an episode on character, we did an episode on competence, we did an episode on caring, and then communication. And so those are sort of in order, but I don't know that they need to be necessarily. They give a little bit of background and some more fundamental ideas, and every other concept that we talk about in the podcast on all the other episodes feed into these 4. So those are always, whether overtly or hidden behind the scenes, those 4 C's are always in the mix when it comes to developing and creating the episodes. But hopefully it's something that's accessible wherever you pick it up.
Well, this episode's been awesome. I know we sort of did it a little bit backwards in that we sort of are doing the why after a few episodes, but I think it's important to know a little bit of the history of when did the science of leadership start? How do we fit into that? Where does this podcast fit in to everything else around it? How does it stand alone? And so what and the now what? What can people do with this now? It makes me really excited to jump in to more of this as we go along. I appreciate getting the chance to talk to you again, as always. Always learn something.
Yeah, it's been great. Hopefully it answers some of the questions. We've had several listeners who've asked, What's the background? What's the why? And so hopefully this episode will help them to understand a little bit more about the heart of and the drive of the Science of Leadership as a podcast. So thanks for taking the opportunity to talk about it, Justin. I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.